Good afternoon. Thank you so much for dialing into today's congressional briefing, Advancing Health Outcomes for Women and Minorities. We have amazing speakers today. You are going to learn so much. It will be a fascinating discussion, and the blinds will be lifted. You will see things you never saw before after today, and hopefully be very motivated to take action. I'm Liz Powell. I am the founder of G2G Consulting, and I will be moderating today's congressional briefing. So what I'd like to do is first give some introductions of our speakers, and then pass it over to the experts, and then we'll close out with some questions. We also are recording, and we'll make sure that you have a copy of this, and we'll post this on our website so that you have easy access. So first, I want to talk about our amazing speakers today. So we have Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, who was first elected back when she was just 18 years old. So she has a lot of experience. She did some other wonderful things as a lawyer and a teacher, came back to politics and was elected to Congress in 2018. She serves as co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. She is a true champion for women's issues and a number of things, all focused on the common good. And she is also co-leading a letter with Congresswoman Lucy McBath and others to push for funding within the Food and Drug Administration for implementing new reporting on exactly how clinical trials will recruit, design, and run these research trials to address the underrepresentation of women and minorities, which is the primary reason we have adverse drug events and so many other gaps in our healthcare system impacting women and minorities. So she's a champion for addressing these issues, and we are so honored to have her join us today. She will be kicking things off. Real quick, let me cover the other speakers who will follow her. Roberta Powell is an entrepreneur, a nurse, a patient, cancer survivor, and currently is getting her PhD in health outcomes. She is a true expert on adverse drug events and has some amazing information to share with us today on reporting of adverse drug events affecting women. Next, we have Valerie Palmieri with Aspira Women's Health. She is a serial CEO and master of startups, worked with several healthcare startups, has more than 30 years of experience in diagnostic laboratory industry, and she is ranked the top 10 entrepreneur of the Springboard Enterprises. So she's going to share her background and statistics today as well on women's health research. Next up, we have Katie Schubert, who is the Executive Director of Society for Women's Health Research. She has amazing background. She was a legislative director on Capitol Hill and previously worked for Congresswoman Nancy Johnson, who many of you may know, was a former co-chair of the Women's Caucus. She has become an advocate extraordinaire, working on a lot of different health issues, and formerly ran all advocacy operations for the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. Then we have Linda Greub from Avestria. She is the co-founder and general partner of the firm, 30 years experience in investing in public and private life sciences companies. Herself is responsible for $3.2 billion of equity capital, and has some amazing statistics to share on our current investment environment and how so little money is going to women-owned businesses and women's health innovation-focused businesses. Lastly, we will have Amy Millman, who is the executive director and heads up Springboard, as well as the Women's Health Innovation Coalition. She's got decades of experience working with Congress and with businesses, and plays a central role in helping these new businesses get to market as fast as possible, and has done amazing work within the women's health innovation space and has a lot of insights to share. So those are our speakers today. Very impressive group. As I said, you will learn new things today you never knew, and hopefully be very motivated to take action. We're going to close out with questions and with some recommendations. We've got 2 specific appropriations funding requests we'd love to have your support on. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Congresswoman Madeleine Dean. Thank you so much.
I am personally committed to expanding public awareness, and I support greater inclusion and prioritization of women's health across our healthcare system. It must be a goal to eliminate the barriers that prevent women and minorities from participating, for example, in important clinical trials. In the past, failures to include all Americans have resulted in a disproportionate impact on women and on minorities. We know certain health conditions, such as autoimmune diseases, affect women at higher rates. That's why I wanted to and did designate last year, September 2020, as Pain Awareness Month to recognize the impact of migraine disease and headache disorders on women. We know they affect men, but we also know they affect women in even greater numbers. Also, to end and recognize the stigma associated often in women's health care. I'm also excited to lead an appropriations letter along with my vice chair, Representative Lucy McBath, that requests funding to require FDA to establish and enforce minimum requirements to ensure diversity in clinical trials. We have seen just this past year the way COVID has impacted men and women differently, and the need to ensure diversity and inclusion in our health studies. This also extends to mental health that I'm keenly interested in, as those aiming to meet the needs of women in perinatal mood and anxiety disorders have reported a lack of available grants or resources or diverse panelists and other barriers to federal funding. These are just a few of the examples of gaps facing women and minorities in our healthcare and biomedical research systems that we must change. I look forward to working with all of you on making a difference to address these barriers. And I look forward to hearing from our speakers. And Liz, I hope you will understand when I have to leave a little early to return to a Financial Services Committee hearing, but my colleague Megan will remain on the line to hear from all the panelists. With that, I throw it back to you, and thank you, Liz.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate those comments. And with that, we will continue on with our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you so much, Congresswoman Dean, for those intro remarks and for joining us today. Thank you to everybody else who joined us as well. We're so excited to have you all here to discuss how we can advance health outcomes for women and minorities. Today's session is brought to you by Springboard Enterprises, the Women's Health Innovation Coalition, and G2G Consulting. My name is Michelle Wolk, and I'm the Women's Health Program Manager at Springboard Enterprises. Springboard is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that was really the first organization back in 2000 to work to accelerate the growth of women entrepreneurs. We've done that for the past 20 years. We've had over 800 women entrepreneurs go through our programs, and they are very successful. A lot of them were in the healthcare space, and so about a year ago, in May of 2020, we launched the Women's Health Innovation Coalition as an initiative of ours to leverage our network of women's health entrepreneurs. Together, our network of entrepreneurs, in addition to other women's health leaders, have come together through our coalition to advance investment, research, innovation, and policy in women's health. We are so excited to have some of our coalition members and alumnus speaking to you today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers that will truly change the way you think about women's health and make you realize the need for these policy changes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Roberta Powell. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and let's get started.
Sorry, good afternoon. I was muted. My name is Roberta Powell, and I'd like to thank Congresswoman Dean, the G2G Consulting, and Springboard for inviting me. I'd like to share my story, my actual journey, and my journey to becoming an entrepreneur and researcher. You see, in 2005, I found a lump, actually 2 lumps in my left breast, and I was later diagnosed and treated for breast cancer. And it was during that treatment that I had experienced a near-miss fatal drug error. You see, I was a type 2 diabetic on oral medication, and I was placed on insulin during my cancer treatment. And I was given what was described as a baby dose of insulin, 4 units before each meal. When I picked up my prescription at a retail pharmacy, I was prescribed and dosed 40 units for each meal. One of those doses would have killed me. I wouldn't be here today. However, I caught the drug error. And that inspired me to consider the importance of really understanding one's health, having a better understanding of health agency so that one can act and prevent and identify anything that might be wrong. So I returned to school. I was, I believe, 45 at the time. And I returned to school to become a nurse educator so that I could help people, patients, particularly women, develop health agency. While a nurse, and I was a nurse for 8 years in various capacities, I observed this very real injurious phenomena called adverse drug events. And it was that, noticing it, seeing it continually, that led me to then become an entrepreneur and researcher to create a solution to effectively address these adverse drug events. Next slide. So adverse drug events include a myriad of things, including adverse drug reactions, medication errors, dosing errors, potentially inappropriate prescribing, that's particularly for the elderly, drug-to-drug and drug-to-food interactions, and allergic interactions. ADEs are one of the leading causes of morbidity and mortality here in the United States. There are, according to the FDA, there are 2.2 million adverse events reports for the year 2020, resulting in 194,000 deaths, and only a fraction of adverse events are reported. Adverse events are the fourth leading cause of death. There's one adverse related death every 2 minutes. Next. So women are more than 2 times affected by adverse drug events. And part of the problem, or part of the issue around it, is that pharmacokinetically as well as pharmacodynamically, we are different. The pharmacokinetics, or what I'll refer to as PK, is the movement of drugs within the body, and pharmacodynamics is the effects of drugs and the mechanism of action. So there are sex differences between PK and DK, and they impact adverse drug events. Women and men are biologically different. Mechanisms of actions involving the body and brain chemistry are different. Next slide. Maya Angelou said it so eloquently. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. You see, prior to 1993, the FDA in its clinical drug trials almost exclusively tested drugs on male mice and white males. Women and men metabolize drugs differently. And therefore, women often receive a higher dose based on just the standard dosing because it's not based on weight, and so therefore women tend to have a more concentrated dose of drugs, and therefore, again, resulting in an adverse drug event. Women have more body fat, which impacts the distribution and clearance of drugs. Next slide. So I've had the opportunity to look at a data set of de-identified adult male and female patients. And what the data revealed is astonishing, that major drug interactions impact women 17% of the time versus men 7%. And for the elderly, older women have more inappropriately prescribed drugs prescribed to them than do men. And then we looked at a study where it shows that the pharmacokinetics, PK, sex differences can predict adverse drug reactions in women 2% of the time. Next slide. So an example of this study, I took just 2 of the drugs. There are 59 drugs, so I didn't want to show all of them, but I am using 2 of the drugs, gabapentin and zolidipine. And it's a sedative, and gabapentin's for nerve pain. But as you can see, in terms of prescribing, women are prescribed these 2 drugs significantly more than men. And yet the side effects or the adverse reactions to these drugs are significant for women, almost twice for women than for men. So for the gabapentin, dizziness and nausea versus fatigue and anxiety. Next slide. So adverse drug events are preventable, they're avoidable, they cause injury and significant costs. And so when I looked at the data set, the de-identified data set, we saw that, again, major interactions, women were experiencing 17%. Women who are over 65, elderly population, were being inappropriately prescribed certain drugs that they should not be. And again, the PK drugs were again prescribed to women at a rate of 2%. And these costs are almost 3 times the cost of women who have no ADEs. So they're still prescribed drugs, but they're not interacting. Next slide.
Technical challenges. This happens in our Zoom world.
I have a thing on my screen saying the link document contains online media. If you trust this, enable.
There we go.
Okay, beautiful. So we're going to go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. So if we apply those percentages, that the aforementioned percentages, to the country, that means that potentially 28.3 million women are being impacted by adverse drug events. And it's costing a whopping $315.5 billion. If those same women had no adverse drug events, it would cost $87 billion, potentially avoidable costs of $22.8 billion. So I thank you for the opportunity to share my story. I am, as I said earlier, a researcher as well as an entrepreneur, and we are developing a solution which includes a mobile app as well as a platform, and we are developing as we speak, and with a lot of promising results to help everyone, but particularly women, develop health agency so that they can make informed health decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think we'll move on to our next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Congresswoman Dean, G2G, and Springboard for this platform to outline the dire state of ovarian cancer and the dire need for change. My name is Valerie Palmieri. I've been in diagnostics for over 30 years, democratizing disruptive technology so that everyone could have access, not only those that could afford to go to a comprehensive cancer center. That technology includes PSA for prostate cancer, 15.3 for breast cancer, and last but not least, CA125. I'm here to show you 3 things, is that we are not done with ovarian cancer. In fact, we are just at the tip of the iceberg. You're going to learn about the plight of ovarian cancer as well as endometriosis, the current healthcare spend, and the very high mortality rates. We're spending a lot of dollars for very little return. And last but not least, as US citizens, I want everyone here to take a stand for your mothers, your daughters, your aunts, and your grandmothers. We all deserve optimal care, and optimal care is a right. Next slide. I'm going to go into a video here that's going to discuss the plight of ovarian cancer, specifically for Black women. And after this, I will show you some stats that support our current discoveries in terms of the disparity in care for Black women. Please play the slide.
Every woman is different. Our makeups are different.
As physicians taking care of women, we have to acknowledge the disparity that exists in ovarian cancer.
40 years ago, CA-125 was created for those who had access to care, primarily Caucasian women.
We have a desperate need for a better test for African American women for early cancer detection, for monitoring, because the current test, the CA-125, is not an adequate test.
We go into our doctor's offices, we go to these different places to receive care, and then we're just given outdated information. It's important to know that Over1+ exists and that it's available.
Over1+ offers testing using a multi-biomarker algorithm, which measures changes in nutrition and inflammation. And that is the very unique aspect of Over1+. It is resolving a disparity in testing that exists for African American women.
We're in the United States of America, and we are still fighting to have a place in our healthcare, and it should not be that. It's important to know that Over1+ exists and that it's available.
Next slide. So here's the reality, and I'm glad everyone is sitting down. Ovarian cancer is the only gender-specific cancer with greater than a 50% mortality rate. So 22,000 women are diagnosed each year, 14,000 women die. If you compare that to prostate cancer, 98% of men survive. Compared to breast cancer going down, 1 out of 2 women die from ovarian cancer. 1 out of 10 breast cancer women die from breast cancer. With Black women who have access to care issues, the mortality is accentuated. The mortality for Black women is 62% versus Caucasian women is 54%. Today, ovarian cancer receives 36% less NIH funding versus prostate cancer. And prostate cancer, as I said, is a 98% survival rate. On the benign disease side, endometriosis affects 11% of all women. If we look around this room, there's probably a majority in this room that are women, but as we know, what we have here is 11% affected with a disease that takes 7 to 9 years to diagnose. So imagine 11% of the population walking around in pain, walking around and missing activities with their family, walking around 2 weeks out of every month with quality of life issues, unable to work. And that actually sums up the burden. Endometriosis burden on the healthcare system is $26 billion on healthcare, $69 billion on economic. The cost is similar to a type 2 diabetic. Next slide. So moving on to the reality for Black women, and I just want to pause here. As you saw in the earlier video, we're using a test today, a 40-year-old test who had access to care 40 years ago was Caucasian women. And so we use a test that's primarily for the cancer type, which Caucasian women get. In addition to that, it's a tumor marker. It just measures a tumor protein. Our technology today can measure nutrition changes and inflammatory changes, which are not race dependent. So here on the right, you'll see OVA1 versus CA-125, and you'll see here that it misses anywhere from 37 to 67% of the cancers in Black women. We just published these studies right before COVID started on 150 women. So OVA1 can detect up to 79% of the cancers in Black women. And we actually have some late breaking news, which I want to share with everyone. We have worked on a 3-year journey to get Medicaid to pay for OVA1. Each state has their own process. You have to get credentialed, you have to get licensed, then you have to reach medical necessity, and then you have to get priced. We have been working as a company of about 50 people pushing to get Medicaid to cover OVA1, and we've achieved it in California, we've achieved it in New York, and we are now finalizing things in the state of Florida. Every single state, and this is a fight that all of us have to fight on every single state, not at national, on every single state, that these women, especially the minority population, get equal access. It's not just those that can afford commercial insurance. It's those that are the Medicaid population that need to get the access. And I'm happy to report we just press released this week. So I just want to again reiterate that the current standard of care is not doing a good job for the Black population. It is missing 37 to 67%, and we need to change this. OVA1 right now is in the guidelines. It is FDA cleared. It is equal to CA125. Our goal as a company is to replace it, and we can no longer use a test that has been sufficiently tested only on Caucasian population. Next slide. What is the root cause for these dire statistics? It really deals with the doctors have inadequate tools. Right now, with endometriosis and ovarian cancer, the only way they initially assess it is physical exam and ultrasound, which are subjective. The next is a blood tumor protein that has been around for 40 years and another tumor protein called Roma. But again, once tumor proteins are circulating in your system, it's too late. The technology that we have actually FDA cleared and ACOG endorsed is measuring nutrition changes and inflammatory changes, which occur earlier in the cancer development process. And then last but not least, typically cancer is diagnosed with a biopsy. You cannot biopsy your pelvic cavity. In fact, in the case of ovarian cancer, you can upstage it. So the need for a consistent standard of care that can be a simple non-invasive blood test for ovarian and endometriosis is required so women can be properly assessed and detected. The disease can be detected early when it has a small burden. It can be treated. And last but not least on this is actually if you detect the cancer early, you can actually cure ovarian cancer. The survival rate at stage 1 and stage 2 is anywhere from 72 to 95%. But we detect very few early. So everyone looks at ovarian cancer as a disease that is really a death sentence. Next slide. I want to now move to the cost side of the equation. We call it managed care, but honestly, it's managed cost. We have the ability with our technology to save lives and save tons of ovarian cancer and endometriosis healthcare spend. This is a study we did with 93,000 medical claims. We reviewed OVA1 versus CA125. And in this, we actually determined that if you catch the cancer at early stage, the cost, one-time cost, is anywhere from $35,000 to $37,000 for that one time. While if the cancer is caught at late stage, the cost per year is up to $200,000. And those women, they live on average 5 years. So the cost is about $1 million to $1.2 million. So in summary, we spend about $5.2 billion a year on ovarian cancer, with 50% of those women dying. With endometriosis, we're spending with healthcare and economic burden $69 billion a year, with affecting 11% of the population, which we're just managing symptoms. We are not managing the disease. So the total cost is about $74 billion just for these two disease states. Next slide. I'd like everyone to get a chance to really understand it in the voice of the patient. The voice of the patient is something that we are looking to elevate here at Aspira, and we've created a patient advocacy group. Here are some of the unheard voices that are part of our patient advocacy group. And I'm just going to read a few of them to you to place you in their shoes in terms of this journey of this disease. Here's Rose saying 5 months of suffering, confusion, feelings of not being taken seriously. Mary Lynn, my doctor was dismissive and said you did not need the testing. Melissa stating my voice was not being heard or taken seriously until it was almost too late. These misdiagnoses could have costed my life. So the common theme we hear here is doctors are not listening. They have to do a lot with very little time. And women and even providers don't have access to the correct testing. Next slide. This is my last slide, and it's my call to action to everyone on this line. And it comes with threefold. Number one, the current standard of care misses 37 to 67% of ovarian cancer in Black women. We need to fund a large Black population trial. We have a trial right now going Einstein Medical Center of Philadelphia, a renowned medical center. But right now, we even during COVID have access to care issues, and we have access to accessing these patients. We need to take a stand and fund a very large trial so that we change the ACOG guidelines and we remove CA125. So OVA1 is not equal to CA125, but we remove it. And we put a tool in there that is for all women. Second is 65% of ovarian cancer is detected at late stage, results in 54% of women dying. We need to make OVA1 the standard of care for early stage for the Caucasian and non-Caucasian population and end late stage detection. And last is 11% of all women are impacted by endometriosis with loss of quality of life, fertility impact, and loss of living well. We have right now a breakthrough device, an endometriosis breakthrough device called EndoCheck that is sitting with the FDA. We need to ensure that endometriosis is considered a debilitating disease and we allow the breakthrough technology to be approved. Congress needs to act now and provide all women, especially minority women, access to the best diagnostic solutions, number one. Number two, we're spending $73 billion a year to manage ovarian cancer and endometriosis in the US. And we must address the disease and not just a lifetime of symptoms or death. Developers of novel technologies and therapies need effective tools to navigate the burdensome regulatory process. We have a breakthrough process today that needs both regulatory and reimbursement parallel process to fast track saving lives. Please, please do not delay the Medicare coverage of innovative technology called MCIT. That right now is in the comment period and it's delayed till May. And we need to ensure the comment period is positive and that diagnostic providers can actually get technology FDA cleared as well as get reimbursement for 4 years as they prove clinical utility. And the last but not least, by enacting accelerated regulatory and reimbursement pathways, this Congress can be the change, finally, that is critically needed to optimize women's health in the US. Thank you all for your time and thank you for your support. And also thank you for considering this additional funding.
Thanks so much. It's always nice to hear us all beating the same drum. I'm Katie Schubert. I'm president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research, and we were founded over 30 years ago on the idea that women and people of color were not included in research, and we work to promote research on biological sex differences, which you all heard a little bit about, as well as improve women's health through science, policy, and education. Next slide, please. So we've seen quite a bit of this through the last few talks, and I think it just highlights the need for continued investment in women's health broadly, but also to dig deeper into some of these health disparities that we're seeing across the spectrum for women at various stages of their lives. And I think I cannot sort of put a finer point on this, but sex as a biological variable really should be a key principle in all research. So building in justification for the exclusion of sexes, if that's appropriate, is really critical when you're thinking about how different treatments or therapies or generally just looking at the differences in disease among sexes. And so it's really important to know that. Also important historically, women and people of color were excluded from medical research, both within, NIH trials and drug trials and requirements through the FDA. And that is as late as the 1990s, so not that long ago. I would, remind us all that women are 50%, over 50% of the US population. And so we're not talking about a small population here. And as people of color grow in terms of a proportion of the population, they're facing greater health disparities throughout the life course and across disease states, excuse me. So we pulled just a few things here in terms of disease burden and impact to sort of highlight these differences and disparities. And so you can see that 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. And it's actually the 5th leading cause of death for women versus the 8th leading cause of death for men. Importantly, the cost to the US are $277 billion in 2020, which is up, expected to grow to $1.1 trillion by 2050, which is a huge burden. The other thing I would say about Alzheimer's disease is not just thinking about women as patients, but also women as caregivers. So often bearing the burden of caregiving for aging parents or spouses who might also be patients as well is important to note. We just heard about ovarian cancer. Again, Hispanic and African-American women who get breast and ovarian cancer are more likely to be diagnosed at a later stage than white women. And although the breast cancer incidence is close between white and Black women that are they look the same, Black women are actually 42% more likely to die of the disease. So huge disparities here. And then finally, looking at cardiovascular disease, it presents differently in men than in women. I think we know that. It often is mis or undiagnosed in women. But digging even further into those disparities, Black women have almost twice the risk of stroke than white women. And Hispanic women are likely to develop heart disease 10 years earlier than non-Hispanics. So huge disparities we're seeing as we dig deeper into these numbers. Next slide, please. So maternal health, as Liz noted, this is sort of where I came from, and thinking about how can we optimize the health of pregnant women in the US. We have a rising maternal mortality crisis in this country. And the CDC noted just a couple of years ago that 3 out of 5 maternal deaths in the US are preventable. Not only that, but if you, again, drill down deeper into the data that's being collected on maternal mortality, you can see that Black women are 3 times as likely to die of a pregnancy-related death, with Native Americans, Alaska Natives, more than twice as likely to die as compared to white women. So not only are we seeing rising maternal mortality rates across the board, we're seeing widening gaps in terms of outcomes and these events for people of color. It's extremely concerning. There's been a lot done over the last few years, particularly in Congress, to really look at this issue, but it's important to note because it does persist. When you think about maternal health as well, maternal mental health should generally be a part of that, although it's generally treated as a separate issue. Nearly 94% of women take at least one medication during pregnancy. And we use this statistic because we think that those could largely also be antidepressants, SSRIs that are likely safe, but women are taking themselves off of their medications for fear of harming their baby. So I would point out that pregnant women continue to be largely excluded from biomedical research, and we're also seeing that during the COVID pandemic in terms of the vaccines. So just something to think about there. Additionally, in terms of maternal mental health, 1 in 5 women experience a mental health condition or substance use disorder during pregnancy or postpartum. And so this may contribute to that rising maternal mortality rate. So when you think about that maternal mortality rate, that's within 1 year of giving birth. And so that could be due to a number of reasons, but we are seeing that maternal mental health does have an impact on that as well. Of note, really critical information here is that 75% of women who do screen as at risk for postpartum depression receive no treatment. This is extremely concerning. We want to make sure, again, that maternal mental health is incorporated back into all maternal health and women's health broadly. And then, of course, of note is sort of the cost of not treating these conditions. A Mathematica study found a couple of years ago that the cost of not treating these conditions is $32,000 per year, which is about $14.2 billion nationally. So we could look at increased screening, referral, and treatment to make sure that not only are we saving money, but we are looking at optimal health care and making sure that we're all doing the best that we can in terms of our own health and well-being. Next slide, please. So thinking just very broadly about the barriers that exist, we know that these disparities in outcomes exist, but why might it be difficult to get trial participation, both for women as well as people of color? The FDA actually just recently released their annual snapshots report. And so we see that while we're doing better in this space in terms of the level of inclusion, there is far more to be done. So some potential barriers, particularly for women, could be time, childcare. It's very difficult to participate in a clinical trial when you may not have that. Transportation, general lack of awareness. Some of the issues that have been brought up as well previously include historical mistrust of the medical system. There's also a lack of diversity among the workforce. So in other words, those who are designing these trials may not reflect the patient population and may just not be thinking about who needs to be included, which we really do need to address. There could be a lack of community connection. So how do you meet people where they are to make sure that they are willing to volunteer for these particular trials? And then again, coming back to that idea of mistrust and even further fear of exploitation within clinical research. So a lot of history there in terms of making sure that, again, how do we meet people where they are and make it as easy as possible and appropriate for them to want to volunteer for clinical research. So I think overall, we really do need to take a comprehensive approach to looking at how to include women and people of color in research and to ensure appropriate representation throughout the United States health continuum. So looking at both the public health system and data tracking, which we have seen to be an issue, particularly during COVID, inclusion in research and clinical trials. So this idea that the research population really needs to reflect the patient population and treatment population. We need to consider health across the lifespan. So what issues, that might occur earlier in your life could potentially impact you later on in life. And we see that in particular related to pregnancy. But if you think about things like endometriosis that was just mentioned, are there other things that you might need to think about as you grow older and age that might have a particular impact? And then ensuring access and coverage obviously can lead to huge disparities. Another piece of important piece of information we would need to know and make sure people have access to healthcare as well. And then finally, that piece of ensuring access and coverage, ensuring the diversity of the biomedical workforce is reflective of the broader population. With greater diversity and inclusion there, we can really get to some of the overarching issues that we're seeing and you've already heard about today. So thank you so much.
Linda, you are up. Linda, are you there? Sorry, folks, having some technical issues. Linda, perhaps you're on mute.
Got it. Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'm Linda Greub, Managing Partner of Avestria Ventures. I just realized my video's not on. Okay. My co-founder, Corinne Neveny, and I founded Avestria in 2019 to address the lack of venture funding going to women's health companies and female-founded life science ventures. Today, I would like to walk you through some of the data that led us to that decision and our conclusion that women's health is both under-researched and underfunded. Next slide. As we know, clinical research and medical education have been based solidly on male biology as the reference standard. Even today, 70% of medical school students say that gender medicine concepts are never or only sometimes discussed, with the assumption that if a physician understands male biology and its response to disease, they can apply the same knowledge to treat women. This, despite the fact that conditions such as pregnancy and menopause are specific to women, other diseases such as Alzheimer's disproportionately impact women, and others such as cardiovascular disease present differently in women than men. Similarly, the resources we as a nation direct towards women's health seem to be every bit as much of an afterthought. Although women account for approximately $500 billion in annual medical expenses, only 4% of all healthcare research and development is targeted towards their health. At the NIH, only 11% of funding is allocated specifically to women's health. I tend to think of the NIH as the primary driver of cutting-edge clinical research. However, the magnitude of venture capital funding for the life sciences is equally significant, exceeding $49 billion. Here, the situation is even worse, with less than 1% of investment going towards women's health. Next slide. When we began to look at why there has been almost a complete absence of investment in women's health in the venture capital community, it was impossible to ignore the homogeneity of the industry. In the US, white males manage 99% of all financial assets. In the venture capital community, 84% of investment partners are men, 78% are white, and 65% of all firms lack any female investment partners. It may then not be surprising that 84% of all venture capital funding went to companies with all male teams. In contrast, less than 3% of funding went to female-founded companies. While you might assume that the life sciences fared better than the more traditional Silicon Valley startups, the percentage of funding to female founders in the life sciences was only slightly higher at 3.1%. Research has shown that venture firms with female partners are 3 times more likely to fund companies with female CEOs than all male firms. So the solution to directing more investment capital towards companies working to improve women's health seems simple. We need to increase the percentage of women investment partners at life science venture firms. Because many women have found it impossible to become a partner at established venture capital firms, numerous women are starting their own firms. However, there's a problem with this. 90% of women-led firms are considered emerging managers. As new firms, they lack the 10-year track records and significant asset size required by institutional investors. Thus, many of these women are stuck running micro funds with less than 100 million in assets. Next slide. So what can Congress do to improve this dismal situation? One place to start would be to encourage the Association of American Medical Colleges to include gender medicine concepts in their curriculum. It is critical we train physicians to understand the unique aspect of women and men's health and predilection to disease, and to provide personalized treatment. Personally, I think the most meaningful thing Congress can do to increase funding towards innovations in women's health is to ask federally funded colleges to set aside a portion of their endowment assets to be run as fund of funds of emerging women and minority managers. This would allow investment dollars to be directed to the next generation of venture capitalists, those who lack the size and length of track record to be when evaluated on a standalone basis to meet an endowment's investment criteria. These are the venture capitalists who are most likely to understand the unique health concerns of women and minorities and have the passion to invest in making changes to the status quo. Similarly, Congress can continue the effort that some representatives have begun to ask federally funded colleges to report the percentage of endowment assets allocated to female and minority managers, with the goal of reaching 50% women and 40% minorities. Closer to home, Congress can request the Thrift Savings Plan to include information about the portfolio managers of the F, S, C, and I funds, requesting 50% of managers be female and 40% minorities. Congress can also designate a portion of SBA grants and assistance programs towards women's health innovation, and thus incentivize private sources of capital to match this investment. Next slide. A solution which would have a more direct impact would be to encourage federally funded colleges to allocate endowment assets to public and private equity funds focused on women's health. Similarly, Congress could ask the TSP to offer an equity fund devoted to women's health. Finally, we would encourage you to ensure that the NIH provides equitable funding for the unique healthcare needs of women and minorities. Thank you all for your time today.
Amy Millman, I believe you are our last speaker, if you're ready and off mute.
Thank you, Liz. I'm Amy Millman. I'm the president and co-founder of Springboard Enterprises. We have been doing business as a nonprofit and supporting women entrepreneurs in both life science and tech for about 20 years. I will tell you, this has been enlightening for me. There are a lot of information that we've talked to you here today that I think is incredibly valuable and thought-provoking as far as what's Congress's real response to or prioritizing of a significant unmet need, which is focusing on research and innovation in women's health. You know, there was an article that came out on a CDC report today talking about women reporting worse side effects from the COVID vaccine. And some of the questions that were raised were, is it that women report more? Everybody knows that women tend to go to their practitioners more than men, but honestly, that belies the real problem, which is there's a mix of factors. And some of them are hormonal, some of them are gene related, some of them are dosing levels, a lot of which some of the speakers have talked about. The fact is, we just don't know because there haven't been enough research, certainly not enough data. And that has impeded a lot of the progress that a lot of the women have had that we work with, the innovators, in working with their, out of their labs and trying to commercialize solutions to women's health. And that's been the biggest problem that we have, getting the data both on all of these diseases and all of these conditions and disorders that either differently, predominantly, or uniquely affect women. There are hundreds of them. And this presents a tremendous unmet need, both financially in the market and for the health of women. And so at some point, given my background in working in Congress and being a lobbyist for many, many years, I said, maybe we should pull together all of the advocates and the practitioners and the innovators and the investors who are looking in this space and figure out what the range of issues are that need to be addressed. What we found were hundreds of them. And so we started the Coalition on Women's Health Innovation to, again, elevate the conversation and the advocacy for prioritizing some of these or all of these unmet needs at some point. This is a long-term goal of the coalition, and one of the reasons why we're doing this briefing today. There are over 200 organizations, individuals, experts in the field participating to date after we launched this last year. You can find it, the URL is womens.health. And so, what's the solution to all of this? Raising the visibility of all of these facts and figures and stories and that were addressed to you today, and what is Congress's role in being able to illustrate what the problem is and create market opportunities for this. You can't solve all the problems, but you can use your bully pulpit to bring together the right people, to raise the visibility, to create market interest in this area, again, that needs so much assistance, so much data, so much reporting. And so with G2G, we've been talking about specific solutions, specific proposals. We supported report language last year in Ag FDA approach to really talk about the design and the reporting of clinical trials that would include more of a gender focus, as was mentioned by Katie. And so the list goes on, and we would like to partner with members of Congress and their staff to be able to, again, elevate this conversation so that we can actually see some results happening for women and women's health overall. So thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you. Thank you all. Those were amazing insights that were shared, statistics, perspective. Hopefully you've all gained some great insight from today. So just to sum up some key points, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So please post your questions in the chat box, in the question and answer box. And we'd love to address them. Also, we have recorded this, and we will send you a copy of the slides and the link so that you can watch it or share it with your colleagues. We will make sure all of that is available to you. So clearly, men and women are different at the cellular level. That's really key. The investment dollars are just not there when you look at ovarian cancer versus prostate cancer, for example. And what's interesting is that we only talked about NIH. Within the Department of Defense, the Congressionally Directed Military Research Program that I'm sure many Hill staffers are familiar with, there is significantly more money for prostate cancer than for ovarian cancer. So even though 90% of men who have ovarian cancer survive, or 99% of men who have prostate cancer survive, we still are putting in $110 million to prostate cancer research just from Department of Defense alone. So that's in addition to NIH funding. For ovarian, it's only 35 million. So much higher death rate, and yet we're putting much less investment into research. Some other key things we heard is how we have to meet women and minorities where they are. I really liked that language. I think that's exactly right, and address sex as a biological variable in all our research. And then how women's health is under-researched and underfunded. We heard that over and over again. And finally, how key data is. So just wanted to close out with a summary, which then leads to our appropriations requests that we'd love to have your support on. So first is for the Ag FDA appropriations bill. Basically, we're trying to address that historic underrepresentation of women and minorities and provide $5 million for the FDA to address this head on and actually require reporting. So by requiring the FDA to report to Congress on the drug sponsors' recruitment efforts, their recruitment design, how they design these trials, how they execute that, the participation, how they run and operate them, addressing those transportation issues, the challenges of participation, really ensuring that they're doing everything possible to increase the participation in clinical trials of women and minorities is really key. And the only way that we see that changing is reporting. And something else I want to point out with NIH research, NIH has done a great job of really addressing and requiring that these factors are addressed, and if they're going to receive NIH funding. Only 50% of research actually is funded by NIH. The vast majority ton is outside that spectrum. However, if you're going to be offered as a drug in America, you have to get approval from FDA. So 100% goes through FDA. So that is why it's really key. FDA steps up and requires these minimum standards to ensure that our drugs are safe and effective for everyone. Absolutely key. And so that is our first request. And so please, we'll close out with our email addresses. Please ask us any questions you have about that. We've got additional data to back up that request. I mean, the adverse drug events being twice as common in women is pretty compelling right then and there, but we will share information for that. And then the second request that we've got is addressing maternal health. And you heard the stats on the challenge of the health issues that are facing many women who are pregnant, but it's not even just the pregnancy, it's through postpartum. And then that entire first year, they're finding all kinds of challenges for women that aren't being addressed in our system. And so we need more research into this to better understand and address, especially the health disparities angle to this issue. So we are requesting that we get a report on all the research that has happened around maternal health and infant mortality by the NIH. What are they funding? What are they investing in? And then we want to get a report on what are the recommendations to address this? How do we make sure that there is no longer such a dearth of research and funding to address these issues? That is the only way that we can truly improve our healthcare outcomes, our health outcomes, and the healthcare that we're providing for women, minorities, and the entire population. One thing I'd like to point out, this actually affects everyone because not just because we have moms and daughters and aunts and nieces, but because women live longer than men. Overwhelming data shows women live longer than men. There is something for men to gain from better understanding how women's bodies function. So think about that. We all can benefit from this. So I think we're going to move on to some questions, which are we really appreciate. What would be some good ways to incentivize greater participation of women and minorities throughout the system also in our clinical trials. Just some, I know you all shared some policy recommendations, but if you have some other ways just to incentivize this ecosystem that would be more supportive of women's health innovation to address the needs that we're talking about today. So would love to put on the screen all of our speakers instead of just me, so we can see everyone, and would love to hear some comments from Linda. Do you want to start off with some comments on how we could incentivize greater participation to address women and minorities?
Sure. We actually just invested in a company called DrugView, and DrugView is focused on improving the clinical trial participation of non-white women in autoimmune disease trials. So what they'll do is, if you join their database, is DrugView will help those women find clinical trials that are appropriate for them, and will enable them to continue to track their experience with drugs once they get on the market. So that's actually the first company we've seen like that, but I think that hopefully there'll be more of those.
That's great. How about you, Valerie? Do you have thoughts?
You know, it's complicated. I mean, I think it's really taking a stand and looking at the fact that we are over 50% of the population. Some of the stats that Linda had and others, I hope that it's grabbing your soul, that we have under-resourced research in women, under-resourced research in minority populations, and we have to take a stand and look at the diseases that are causing the heartaches, look at the diseases that have the high mortality rate. Although ovarian cancer is a rare disease, the mortality has not changed. Although endometriosis doesn't have a high mortality, it affects 11% of the population. So it's having the voices heard and ensuring that, you know, funds are appropriated correctly based on where the need is versus based on who's the squeaky wheel.
Great. So funding is absolutely key. Where we invest those dollars is vital. So that's a good takeaway for everyone, especially Capitol Hill staff, as you're working on the appropriations process. It looks like we're running over a bit. I don't know, Amy Millman, if you had some final thoughts with all your years of experience working with so many innovators in this space, would love to pass to you.
No, it's all about data. And that is probably the most important thing that Congress can help with. Congress sits on an enormous amount of data, but there's so much that haven't been collected because it hasn't been prioritized. So just including in whatever legislation or reporting requirements that are in there, a gender focus on reporting would probably change the dynamics of what's happening on investments in both research and innovation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know we're over our time by 3 minutes, so would like to wrap this up. Thank you everyone for dialing in today. We will be following up with you. We appreciate your support. And like I said, hopefully the blinds have been lifted and now you see we have got to take action. So we're excited to work with you to do that. Thank you all for dialing in today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.